Welcome, everyone, to the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative's second Urban Conversation. I'm Eve Blau, an urban architectural historian in the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Graduate School of Design, and one of the three co-directors of the initiative, along with Liz Cohen and Bruno Carvalho. As you know from the poster of this event, Bruno Carvalho was originally slated to host today's conversation. He's here with us, but he isn't chairing the event because he has to attend to his toddler daughter who is at home quarantining due to COVID exposure. He will, however, be hosting the next conversation, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So as I said, this is the second event in a series of urban conversations that will continue throughout this academic year and probably the subsequent year as well. The goal of the conversations is to create a forum for visiting scholars to Harvard who are working in the urban field to share their work in progress with an interdisciplinary community of Harvard faculty and students who are interested in and concerned with urban issues and environments. The aspiration is also to initiate conversations that will continue and be ongoing, hopefully, beyond these events. So in these conversations, we invite a Harvard faculty member or a graduate student to offer a response to the talk, after which we open the floor to you, our interdisciplinary audience, for Q&A and discussion. Now, before I start today's conversation, I'd like to let you know about the next urban conversation, which will take place on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2022. And the topic of that conversation will be Constructing Old Age, Race, Ethnicity, Religion, and the Architecture of Homes for the Aged. And our speaker for that session is Willa Granger, an environmental historian who's visiting from the University of Texas at Austin and who is a fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard this year. The respondent will be Anne Forsyth, who's a professor in urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and respondent. Our speaker is Claudia Gastro. She's an anthropologist and senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. At Harvard this year, she's an Urban Studies Foundation International Fellow and an affiliate of the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative. Claudia's work explores the intersection of politics and urbanism in Africa, and her forthcoming book, The Aesthetics of Belonging, Building Politics in Oil Boom Luanda, examines how the built environment came to mediate understandings of political belonging in Luanda following the end of Angola's civil war in 2002. And her work on Luanda has appeared in City and Society, in the National Journal of Urban and Regional Research, in Africa, in Antipodes, and in Politique Africaine. In today's talk, which is titled Proliferating Enclaves, De-risking and the Making of Usable Space in Urban Africa, she's going to speak about a new project on African-financed real estate investment. And in this project, which is part of a larger collaboration, she focuses on Johannesburg and the ongoing legacies of racial imperial formations in the urban spatial practices of enclaving and de-risking. Now, responding to Claudia's talk will be Renegan Raidu. Renegan is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at Harvard, And his dissertation research is concerned with lifestyle estates in the Gauteng city region, their political, economic origins, as well as their social and spatial consequences. His research has been funded by awards from the Royal Anthropological Institute and the Fulbright Hays program. Renegan holds an MPhil in social anthropology from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, as well as a BA in anthropology and a BS with honors in chemistry from the University of Iowa. Renegan's scholarly writing has been published in the edited volume Anxious Joburg, The Inner Lives of a Global South City, published by Wits University Press in 2020. His work has also been published in journals, including Langmuir, and the Journal of Materials Chemistry. His public scholarship has appeared in the Mail and Guardian and Mamba Online. So just in terms of the procedure here, after Claudia's talk and Renegan's response, we will have time for you to ask questions. And at that time, I will ask you to use the hand raising icon, and I will call on you to ask your question when your hand is up. And when I do, please identify yourself with your name, and affiliation. And I'll remind you of this once again when we get to that point. So now I hand it over to Claudia Gastro.
Thank you so much, Eve. And I wanted to start just by thanking Eve and Andrea and Bruno for kind of organizing this event, Renegan obviously for agreeing to be my discussant and bounce my ideas off me. And then the Harvard Urban Melon Initiative, AAAS here, who are both hosting me, and the Urban Studies Foundation, who was very generous to fund this day at Harvard so I could access the wonderful resources that this university has. So I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, I have very fancy headphones that seem to fall out all the time. So unfortunately, I have to put up with this. So I'm actually primarily at Harvard finishing my book, but I really wanted to share sort of new research with you guys. And so what I'm presenting today is really quite preliminary. I've just kind of begun reading, have done a few interviews on the topic. But essentially, what I'm looking at is how, if you want, African managed finance and kind of intra-African finance is shaping urban space in the continent. And in particular, I'm interested in how South African financiers and financial services are exporting certain kinds of urban development, and with that sort of forms and spatiality to the rest of the continent. And so this project is part of a broader collaboration between researchers based in Ghana, Mozambique, Norway, and the UK, entitled, I'm forgetting the title, but on urban enclaving, which basically tries to look at the rise of enclaving as an urban formation and kind of imaginative practice across the African continent. And part of what we're doing is trying to kind of move beyond the initial works in enclaving, which already looked at questions around sort of fear, securitization, segregation, and begin to think of more varied ways or more varied reasons behind the rise of enclaving as an urban formation, but also think of it in some sense as an imaginative practice that is shaping the way that people approach cities. And this, of course, makes Renegan the perfect discussant, because I know he's also thinking through these questions for his PhD work. And so we're looking at the intersection between kind of the lived experience of enclaving, and some people are doing research in gated communities and other forms of enclaving, some people looking at design and aesthetics, and then of course finance, to try and see how these three realms sort of work together. And so my own work tracks teams of property developers who are based in Johannesburg as they plan and execute projects across the rest of the continent. And this actually largely being projects in Nigeria and Ghana, which are seen as kind of the two big potential sites for urban development, making profit extraction. Interestingly enough, and we can sort of dwell on this more if people want, another key node in this is Mauritius. And so what I've been finding is that whilst the teams are based in South Africa, companies are opening up offices in Mauritius in order to move finance more easily into the rest of the continent. And so there's kind of a South African, Mauritian, Nigeria, Ghana link, which is opening up as a space of circulation of money and expertise. And so in tracing these kind of movements of finance and expertise, the project is more broadly trying to engage both with regional concerns, but I think also broader scholarly debates about racial capital, enclaving, and the legacies of, in South African case, post-apartheid imperial formations. But I think we can think of these more broadly as sort of Anne-Laure Stoller and other people who've looked at her work have. And I'm very happy to talk about that more broadly for those who are interested. But for this specific presentation, I'm picking up on one aspect of the research that I've been pursuing, which is really looking at how imaginations of risk, and especially financial houses kind of framing of the African continent as essentially a space of extreme risk, okay, catalyzes multiple forms of financial enclaving of expertise, and with that, I would argue ultimately material forms of enclaving. And part of this is trying then to think of enclaving as not just driven by kind of these consumer demands for what people see as safe spaces or sites of prestige, but also inherent to kind of a logic of how finance capital is working on the African continent. And I'm doing that, kind of looking at this by looking at what people refer to as de-risking, which sounds like a very technical term somehow, but is really kind of a set of practices which are unique to each investment to a certain extent, that are engaged in to incentivize investment by reducing risk to potential financiers. And by looking at these processes, one of the things I'm really trying to do is kind of, in some ways, get beyond this focus on mega city development, which has been so big in literature on African urban development in recent years. So those kinds of projects also involve kind of de-risking, but they're much more linked to kind of big state and huge kind of private corporate investment, clearing a few swaths of land. But a big amount of what's happening in urban development in Africa are things like office parks, malls, maybe slightly smaller partial precinct residential developments, although those are a bit rarer. And these financiers who are based in South Africa, moving through Mauritius, are really looking at those kinds of projects. And I think by kind of looking at the de-risking profiles around these, we start to get a better sense of how enclaving is kind of producing certain kinds of urban landscapes at if you want, at a more micro or medium level. And so the paper that I'm developing, in which I'm kind of presenting the beginnings of here today, is interested in how these imagine of space and geography of Africa as a site of risk, and their intersection with financial practices ultimately produce certain material formations on the ground. And as I've said, this is an extremely preliminary piece of work, but I'm really interested in getting feedback to move this forward. Okay, and so for some context for the study, for those of you who do research in Africa, and even for those of you who don't, you might know that for the last 2 decades, we've witnessed a huge real estate boom across the African continent, especially in countries for kind of the first 15 years of the 2000s that were considered large commodity producers like Angola or Nigeria. But really we've seen it across with projects such as Konzo City in Kenya, Echo Atlantic in Nigeria, Kilamba, which is very famous in Rwanda, okay? And this real estate boom was generally linked to an exuberance about what consulting companies were arguing was the emergence of a new middle class on the continent, as well as a belief from property developers that Africa was, and they literally use this terminology, the new frontier of kind of property development and extraction, that post-2008 financial crisis and the rest of the world, the site for kind of extracting money through property had now moved to Africa. In some ways, this has subsequently collapsed in the wake of COVID and other developments. And one investor who I interviewed described the Johannesburg Stock Exchange property section as, quote, a graveyard at present, which doesn't bode well for those investments. But even as he was saying that, he described what he called the urban African mass consumer, and those are his words, as, quote, the biggest financial opportunity of the 21st century. And so these investment houses are finding a contradiction, that they find property such a risky investment, and we can get into that, but they find Africa and large and African consumers to be the biggest potential source of income and profit for them in comparison to other regions of the world, if they could just figure out how to access that, okay? And this is basically where the question of de-risking comes in. So the argument is that residential property or real estate in general is the riskiest investment you can make on the African continent, more than mining, more than anything. Why? So according to, I'm listing the reasons that investors cite. So they sort of create these risk index, create these imaginations of risk. But essentially they attribute the difficulties to investment in real estate, and especially residential. Actually, no one I spoke to was willing to invest in residential real estate. These are all commercial investments, as linked to a variety of issues. But what you can see is that they produced kind of imagination of the African continent, but which they argued as excluding South Africa. And I know people who've read Hannah Appel's work know that she has an argument about how the oil companies also talk about South Africa as ex-SA, as excluding South Africa from these imaginations. So the African continent is basically framed in their risk analyses as a space beset by risk and predictability. And so the primary job of these kind of South African developers, or the primary jobs they imagined for themselves, then hinged off creating markets for investment. So the idea was there wasn't really anywhere particularly that was, in a sense, obvious for investment. The practice of de-risking had to sort of enclave office space, produce it as low risk or risk-free, that when it then enabled the possibilities for actually investing in real estate and tapping these sort of huge profits which they imagined to exist. So the reasons they gave where property is particularly problematic is that it introduces you to a legislative environment of kind of negotiations over land, which was very difficult. There are high rates of informality in practice of construction and saving, and even market sizes and spreads in comparison to the rest of the world, a lack of reliable financial instruments. In most African countries, there's not an established sort of mortgage system. To just give you an understanding, in Angola, the interest rate on a home loan is 25%. Okay, so you understand that, yeah, and that's very common across various other parts of the continent. So it's not like the United States or other places where you go to a bank and you're paying back. I mean, the US sounds very low. In South Africa, it's like, I think still 7% at this point, but that's much higher than the States. So, and a very, very off-cited risk was the fact that they said in most African countries, there is a construction and savings culture of incremental building and incremental savings, as opposed to putting money in kind of banks in the long term to then take out a loan. And so there was a sense that the entire financial structure of much of the continent prevents investment in kind of real estate. And so their job then was to do what they saw as de-risking. And as I said, this sounds kind of technical, but it's really sort of a catch-all phrase for any kind of practice that is seen to reduce risk to investors, thereby making a potential investment more attractive. And to give you an example, which is the clearest, which is usually from mining, for instance, in mining, investors would be assured that mineral rights have been secured. There would kind of be documentation of that the best experts in drilling and extraction have been procured, and that in the case of Africa, at least, I was told that insurance had been taken out against political instability, usually with Lloyd's of London, apparently. So that if there is a coup or a sudden state change of government, investors in the mining venture are guaranteed some of their investment back, regardless of what happens. So the problem was that in real estate, these activities became incredibly more complex and take on, in some sense, much more tangible, material, and situated practices than for many other kinds of investments. Why? Primarily because of the question of land, which exposes these kinds of investments to customary law, for instance, which means going down onto the ground and having to actually speak to people as opposed to just dealing with contracts and governments at a sort of more macro level. ordinary conflicts over ownership of land. It's very difficult to know who owns what in many African cities. And so, but also fears about quality construction, expertise, and upholding of contracts. And as I as I said, no one I'd spoken to has actually invested in residential real estate. All of them thought it was too difficult to generate profit because of a lack of reliable mortgage tools and housing purchase practices, which focus more on incremental savings, as I've said. So instead, they're largely focused on tapping what they saw as commercial real estate opportunities, which is malls and office parks, okay? So there is a growing literature on property developers in Africa and internationally, and I'm starting to read that. But what I really want to draw out for now, and what I'm interested in is the ways in which these risk logics and attempts to kind of de-risk around them produce what I'm kind of provisionally calling nested enclaves, that it sort of creates a logic of enclaving where you have kind of the financial enclaving leads to certain forms of expertise enclaving, which leads to certain forms kind of enclaving about who's even allowed to be present in these buildings. And so kind of beginning to see enclaving as just a logic which is inherent to the idea of how people think they can extract from the continent. We know these arguments for mining, but what I'm interested in tracking through these residential projects is how, in fact, this is much larger ramifications through kind of financial circuits on the continent and in general. And so, sorry, I'm seeing this out. And so enclaving becomes sort of key in the possibility of creating exploitable spaces and urban sites for investment and development. So as such, this paper, which I'm sort of working on, which I'm hoping you guys can give me feedback on some of the ideas I'm putting out there, is trying to orientate discussions of enclaving, as I said, away from work which focuses purely on securitization, which has really been the dominant work in African cities. Some other work has looked at kind of class performance, but that's really kind of looking at it from, if you want, sort of a consumer perspective, people who are buying into these estates and why they do that. I'm kind of exploring the idea that there's something more fundamental about the way that money circulates and people think about investment on the continent that produces these formations. And as such, I'm also trying to think about the way that finance, architectural form, design, material practices kind of intersect in the shaping of cities. And so to give you just kind of a small sense of how this would work in practice, I know I'm trying not to run over time, so I think I have about 5 minutes left. I'm just going to sort of very briefly begin to think about how these nested enclaves work and how they kind of proliferate enclave financial flows, expertise, and physical spaces. And so I'm going to walk you through just how kind of one South African company managed a commercial real estate investment in Nigeria. And I'm just going to do it in very general terms at the moment. And so to give you a sense, this was a commercial investment, a mixture of kind of stores and office space. It's just one building. The company had the investment house had set itself a 5-year limitation in order to generate a profit. And in doing this, they had to draw on investors and convince them that a number of de-risking initiatives had been put in place to enable that kind of profit in a 5-year space. And what I'm arguing is that in trying to de-risk, it created a specifically South African chain of expertise that enclaved the project off from the perceived risk of the rest of the continent, in many ways reiterating civilizational discourses that underpin the practices of racial capitalism that characterize the apartheid economy, and therefore kind of seems that these sort of imperial post-apartheid formations are moving into the rest of the continent as South African capital becomes more and more involved in urban development there. And so this is just a few things that they did. And I find it really fascinating because some of them are really hands-on actions and some of them are kind of more at the level of finance if you want. And so the first one was land. And so what they explained to me was when they engaged in projects in many other parts of the continent, they would locate land which they thought would be good for investment. Then they would purchase it and leave a sign up for a year which stated that the land had been purchased. And the reason behind this was they were trying to flush out other claimants to land. okay? So they were waiting to see who would come out and say that they also owned the piece of land, because it is so hard to track in many urban sites who actually owns what. You couldn't attract investors without absolutely guaranteeing that you had the land and you had the land rights clear. So that was kind of the first process of de-risking, okay, was purchasing land and waiting for other claimants, moving that through the courts. And that took for them, they claimed, about a year. Okay. The next step, okay, was investors. Was primarily, so it's South African investors, as I've said. This is not necessarily de-risking, this is trying to attract investors. So this is kind of drawing investors. What they did, however, to kind of de-risk the flow of capital was, even though this is quite a large bank whose property development office is based in South Africa, they opened up a sub office in Mauritius with really only 1 or 2 people in it, because it is really difficult to move foreign capital through South Africa. They opened up in Mauritius because Mauritius has kind of sold itself as a space which enables flows of money in and out of the African continent. And so there's been a kind of a quite rapid delisting of property companies from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and moving them to the Mauritian Stock Exchange in order to enable easier flow of money for real estate development. And with that kind of guaranteeing investors that there'll be fewer blockages in the system. So there's kind of a financial lag of de-risking. The most interesting one for me, however, became if you want an enclaving of expertise. And so because of an extreme lack of trust from many South African investors about expertise on the rest of the continent, they guaranteed South African engineers, South African designers, South African project managers, and really some of the only kind of, if you want, local input into the project were sometimes the actual construction workers or local construction companies in Nigeria that were contracted to build, because there was no way of getting South African construction companies up there. In some ways, this sounds really extreme, but for those of you familiar with Chinese construction companies on the continent, this is actually quite a common practice from China as well. And it's not just about profit, it's also about de-risking. And so you have an enclaving of money flowing from South Africa, then South African expertise, which feeds into questions about design of the building, who conceptualized it. And you actually had South African project managers flying up on a weekly basis to go and check the project. Okay, so there's a sense in which it creates the South African bubble in this other foreign space. Okay. Finally, and this was also really interesting, was the question of anchor stores. Okay, and this has to and this speaks then to kind of the more material results we're talking about. I haven't had a chance to interview designers yet, kind of moving from the bankers to the designers, if you want. I know they use the same designers for many of these projects because these are designers, or not individuals, but kind of companies which are seen as having Africa expertise that are based in South Africa. But a really fascinating aspect of this for me was the question of anchor stores. So you can't draw on investors unless you have a major anchor store. That's usually a sort of a large grocery store or kind of general store of some kind. And investors insisted generally that these be South African stores. So for those of you that know South Africa, we're thinking of a ShopRite or a Pep, maybe a Pick and Pay in some cases. And so, as I said, there's kind of this multiple nesting and enclaving off of the project from other businesses, practices, experts, etc., on the rest of the African continent. Okay. However, it was still viewed as unsuccessful. Okay, not in this particular case. I think this project is still kind of semi-ongoing, but kind of stoking investor fears and kind of discussions was a similar project which happened in Ghana, which then collapsed because of what they viewed as macroeconomic instability in Ghana. Okay, so a currency crash. And so the kind of debate around this remained a debate about the reason why that project had failed was really the inability to closet, to enclave this project off from Ghana's larger kind of macroeconomic problems. And so I'm interested in this particular paper that I'm working on, and perhaps moving into the rest of the project, and drawing of scholars such as Wangui Kumari, who've raised questions about kind of how these sort of South-South investment projects sort of present themselves as different forms of capital, different flows of capital, but in many ways just reproduce the kind of colonial racialized formations that people have typically assumed belong to kind of Euro-American historical investments. I'm interested in the way that this kind of the use of de-risking works through a promise of national cultural familiarity. And as a result, enclaves a project from a perceived dangerous environment of risk, which is generally the continent outside of South Africa, thereby reproducing the very logic of hierarchized difference that Cedric Robinson would argue lies at the heart of racial capital. And so for kind of the larger project, tracking what seemed kind of through risk analysis, hiring in of experts, design practice, these very innocuous practices, which I believe, and I'd have to follow more, are kind of reproduce, if you want, a post-apartheid imperial formation, but moving out across the rest of the African continent. And so that is where I will leave that. And these are just kind of questions that I'm pursuing in sort of a little bit further. If anybody wants to look these up, where I'm hoping to go with these projects are kind of the imaginaries of Africa that are kind of behind the workings of finance on the continent, the afterlives of apartheid and other imperial formations and shaping economic logics. As I said, enclaving is kind of inherent to the workings of accumulation and extraction, not just in mining. And finally, the intersections of finance and form, how these kind of nested logics of enclave shape built environment and other spatial forms. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Can you stop sharing your screen? There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Claudia. The data is fascinating. I particularly love the opening slide being about fractals, because I think risk is emblematic of a kind of metric that travels between scales, and that's what makes it so useful in urban development. But as far as I know, and I'm no expert in the anthropology of risk, but most of the anthropology of risk is focused on things like finance, and not on the making of space. And I think the wonderful thing about this project is that it can really help us understand how metrics like that move across scales and help actually make scale itself. And I probably have to apologize to Professor Blau, because I in another paper about related to another paper about metrics, I had already said a lot about scale and disenchantment, but I think they're relevant here as well. And I'm also really happy to move, and as you know already, to move away from the explanations of segregational urban forms as like being dependent on fear of crime, which is like a very easy and to a large extent relevant explanation, but for anthropologists, a relatively unsatisfactory one, and one that doesn't capture much more than it says. The wonderful thing about discussing risk in the context of urban development is that it has a potential to bring together so many literatures and sets of ideas in a really productive way. So in my head, I've organized my comments from like smallest to largest to be scalar, precisely because it's scale that seems so important here. So things like, I'm kind of orientating this towards like a forward-looking project that I know you haven't collected all of the data on. So it's just kind of a lot of thoughts about de-risking and space. So things like indicators, questionnaires, protocols, research tools are applicable in so many situations. And so many situations outside of like where the data is extracted, that I think that's what really de-risking is about. That like the category of risk is about moving between scales. But risk as a word or as a concept is something so curiously abstract, but that we all think about if we are people who like make investments, if we invest our retirement funds, if we try to buy a property. It's something that we think about, but is weirdly non-tangible. I mean, for people like Mary Douglas, risk is a cultural phenomenon that is reinstantiating hierarchies that already exist and social structures that already exist, which is what you alluded to when you were talking about remaking the apartheid past. There are other anthropologists who think about risk, who would say that risk is kind of like witchcraft accusations in that it explains misfortune. So this is a kind of category or way of thinking that that attunes us to the world in which we already live. And this is where, I mean, in other words, measurements of risk, although they come from the world of purportedly disenchanted finance and capital, function as explanations for why things happen the way they do. What constitutes a risk and to what extent it is risky is of central importance here, because risk exposes the values of the society in which it originates. But it's difficult to say in your case what that society is. It happens to be about development in South Africa, but it doesn't have to appeal to other South Africans necessarily in order to be built. There are investors, probably foreign investors, potential renters who need to be convinced, and measurements of risk have to speak to all of them, which is why they have to be packaged in forms that can travel between scales. So I think a kind of Latourian analysis might be very useful here. There's a lot about which Latour and I disagree, but certainly an analysis of indicators in a very STS way and how they convince or don't convince people would be very useful. But in blackboxing those indicators, of course, a lot gets forgotten or ignored, and it's the remainder that might also be interesting. Enclaves especially have a great propensity to being haunted by risk. I mean, I think outside of South Africa, it reminds me of films like Poltergeist, where like the Native American grave over which the new development is built literally haunts the people who build over it. And I don't think the comparison is trivial, because ancestral graves, as you'll already know, play a key role in land claims in South Africa's recent history and are especially troublesome for property developers. There's a whole consulting industry built around heritage consulting for that reason, not to mention the whole consulting industry built on people who are effectively cultural risk managers, people who like serve as conduits between the developers and the land claimants. But those risks are difficult to quantify in the same way, or in the way that financial institutions are used to quantifying risk. So to what extent do those risks end up being meaningful to investors, and in what terms are they meaningful? Convincing people that they're not at risk is also an aesthetic pursuit. You can tell people that they're safe, but if they don't feel safe, then they're not safe. Would you rather, listen to, a lot of that has to do with like the aesthetic environment. So like, would you rather listen to gunshots or to soft jazz? how are investors lured into the prospect of investment? I think a lot happens outside of the financial indicators that do the work of convincing. And that can challenge the more like Weberian point about disenchantment. We collectively reinvest some kind of superhuman, even divine agency in artifacts like risk assessments. Finally, and this is like maybe pushing a bit too far, but I'm sure you'll tell me if it is. I think this work has the potential to say something really important about the uneasiness with which we make space at present. There's a particular kind of, in my head, I'm imagining this cinematic effect of like glitching, where the image kind of, I don't know how to describe it besides that. So no longer do the financiers really know the terms of seeing, but risk can kind of come from anywhere. And the reason one always needs risk analysts is maybe because risk is always changing. This is, on the one hand, an abstract question, but on the other hand, also a very material question, especially about rendering the material world in representations. So perhaps in conversation with Henri Lefebvre and his notion of representational space, I think you can say a lot about how space is made through characterizations of risk. The final point I'll raise is that enclaves are, I think, always risky forms of placemaking. The fact that they need to be made is the problem. As people like Wendy Brown have said, the erection of walls is a statement of the failure of sovereignty. So the fact that you have to enclave in the first place is testament to the idea that there's already a risk outside that is unmanageable. Because it were the terms of enclaving taken for granted, you wouldn't need to state your enclave in such explicit terms. Yeah, and I'll end there. Sorry, I know that was a lot.
Great, thank you very much, Renigan. We are a little short on time. I think Claudia, ideally we would want you to respond, but I think if you agree, we should open it up to questions from the audience, if that is agreeable to you. So as I said before, if you would like to ask a question, please use the hand raising icon, and I will call on you to ask your question. And I see that there's a question, Emmanuel. I'm afraid I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce your name correctly.
Champong.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just Emmanuel is fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Claudia. I enjoyed your talk, and I enjoyed Renigan's response or comment. I have two questions, but in terms of Renigan's comment, the last one about that an enclave suggests the presence or the reality of risk, but also from the perspective of economic history, an enclave economically also suggests the absence of forward and backward linkages to a local or regional economy. And so we use enclave sometimes not just in terms of risk, but in terms of its connectedness or the absence of it to a local or to a regional economy. I had two questions. One, I was intrigued by your example from Ghana, and you didn't kind of speak much to it about an investment that failed. And I was hoping you would maybe speak a little bit more about that. But it connects to the attractiveness of a site of investment. And there's a sense in which, though Nigeria is politically unstable, everybody wants to get into Nigeria because of its huge population. And Lagos in itself exists as an enclave, the whole city. It's like an economy hived off. It doesn't matter what is happening in the rest of Nigeria. And it makes me set Nigeria side by side with Ghana. In Ghana, there's some oil, there's some mining, but what would make Ghana attractive versus, let's say, Nigeria? And why did the investment in Ghana fail? And you didn't mention whether are these office parks, is it just rental or they are selling these? So just a few details. And then my second question had to do when you were talking about anchor stores. And it made me sort of reflect on our first experience of South African companies were like companies like Nando's, Steers, and MTN. And MTN's profit, about a third of MTN's profit comes from just Nigeria.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that you would reflect maybe sort of a chronology of South Africa's capital's engagement north of the Limpopo, and what your work tells us about the nature of South African capitalism. So not just where they are going, but what can we learn about South African capital from your work? So thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Achumbang. Those are very important, and I hope I can do them justice, but I will try to answer them and maybe kind of allude to some of the issues that Renegan raised. In terms of, so it's interesting that you bring up Lagos, because Lagos is kind of enclave from the rest of Nigeria, but it's also seen as extremely risky. So the city people really like is Abuja, because Abuja is seen as predictable, right? Who owns the land is clearer. There's feeling that there's kind of a rule of law. So if you can somehow get a development in Abuja, then you've really like done well. So people want Lagos precisely for kind of the reason when I was citing that one investor where they said, there's meant to be this untapped huge market. And if they can just figure out how to tap it, they should be able to make more money than everybody else, right? And Lagos kind of represents that, but it represents also in people's imaginations just the chaos of legislation, land, everything, in ways which Abuja, which is slightly smaller market, but is much more kind of manageable in terms of the kinds of indicators that investors like. So it's interesting to think of those two cities in some sense in conversation with each other when we think of investment in Nigeria. Although obviously Lagos is the, I don't know, is the big pot to somehow access. Where Lagos is Lagos. There's no other city like it, I think. In terms of Ghana, I think, the attraction, the other country that was mentioned a lot, but South Africans are less involved in it because there's kind of capital from the Middle East and Indian Ocean that comes in is Kenya, for instance. And I think Ghana occupies a very similar situation or a very similar kind of structural position in the eyes of a lot of investors as, let's say, Kenya, i.e. it's seen as in general, a more predictable economy, more predictable legislative environment, more investor friendly in many ways than Nigeria, which is less predictable. So I think, especially at time period, it seemed that both Kenya and Ghana were sites where there was maybe not as much wealth, let's say, as in Nigeria, but there were other forms of attraction, i.e. a growing and seemingly stable middle class, a growing capacity to consume. And I think, we've seen the opening of malls in Ghana over the last kind of decade and a half. So the project in Ghana, I can't name it yet because then you would know exactly who the investment house was. But my understanding was this was actually a mixture of some commercial and some residential. They had a few buildings. Some of them were, in fact, residential, high-end residential, and that might already give you an idea of where that might be given recent investments. And they said that there had been a currency crash in Ghana, which had knocked their profit predictions and therefore made it difficult to get anchor tenants difficult to convince renters to come in. So this was primarily renters in the commercial sector, but once their anchor tenant pulled out, the project and the perception of being able, let me backtrack it, they wanted a profit in 5 years. So there's a distinction between closed investments and floated investments. So floated investments go on the JSE, and those you can think of like a 20-year profit margin. And so those are now much more favored, because initially people were thinking of these sort of shorter 5-year projects where you would build a project, get an anchor tenant, bring in renters, and then sell it off to someone with, I can't remember the exact, I actually have it in my notes, and there's exact kind of percentage profit when they take into account kind of taxes, electricity, etc. And they had, because of the currency depreciation, they had failed to get in the anchor tenants that they wanted, and therefore the kind of promise of profit, etc., from rental had crashed. But of course, their explanation was that they had failed to enclave the project from quote unquote macroeconomic instability. So those kinds of processes then become kind of refracted through this sort of discourse about needing to better enclave in future. The thing which could set that off, and this is something I didn't bring into the talk, was this question of temporality. So how long was a project exposed to kind of certain forms of perceived instability? And being able to draw out that investment period, let's say to a 20-year period via stock exchange floating, is another form of de-risking for investors, right? That you can extend the temporality of that project. But that means that they have to be in it for the long haul. And so there are these kind of exchanges and perceived risk between the capacity to turn around in a shorter time period and the risks that brings with it versus longer time periods, but having to be present in what is seen as risky spaces for longer periods. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to what you were talking about. I think I hadn't thought of when you're talking about kind of the absence of forward-backward linkage to a local regional economy, but I think that's really key, because what you're seeing there, and I think this speaks to South African capital, is wanting to move capital in and connecting to those regions in ways that can extract, but not necessarily wanting to have to deal with the after effects of what that may mean in terms of taking on risk. And I think what as I'm sure you are aware, South African investment has not always been very successful in many parts of Nigeria. I mean, MTN is a huge success story. And I think what we see with big companies such as MTN, ShopRite, is increasingly their profits are being made outside of South Africa. In fact, South Africa is no longer necessarily the biggest market for these companies. And that's why it is in fact very effective when there's xenophobic violence in South Africa, if the Nigerian president says they're going to hit MTN as a result, because South African capital gets scared, then the government gets scared, and that has kind of knock-on effects. So I think what we're seeing is a story of South African capital, if you want, or big capital, big banks, etc., which have shaped the South African economy and sort of emerged during colonialism and apartheid and took on very specific structures, wanting to spread into the rest of the continent, but trying to do that in a way which kind of reiterates South African practices of business. And it doesn't necessarily work. And so what they do, and this speaks a bit to what Renegan was saying about kind of actually understanding risk evaluation as very much not a process in sense of disenchantment, but actually a sort of a re-enchantment of the world, is they want what they see as kind of Africa experts within their own ranks. And a lot of these senses of risk are not, yes, they have risk analysis and risk indicators, but they also want like the guy who says he knows Nigeria, who gets sent out twice a week to kind of watch the process happening, because he's meant to have like a gut feeling for how to measure these things, right? So there's kind of a sense of needing to maintain a South African system, and this perception, although it's not all investors would agree, as there were some very disparaging remarks made about the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, I will say that in my interviews, of kind of better expertise, but be able to kind of extract these profits. And so I think they kind of think through this by creating mediators, who are usually particular individuals or companies who these banks see as being able to kind of observe and balance risk and ensure quality at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you in particular, Claudia and Renegan. And we have come to the end of our time. In fact, we've surpassed it a little bit. But as I said before, we hope very much that these conversations and this conversation will continue beyond this event. And certainly people who are here in the audience, Claudia and Renegan are here, and you can contact them and continue the conversation. So I want to thank you all very much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Urban Conversation. So thank you very much again. This was wonderful, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.